Welcome to another episode of What Happened, where, listen, I know we just did a Capcom episode like less than a month ago, but this is Fighting Evolution, possibly Capcom's worst internally developed fighting game ever. It was such a disaster every which way that for a while it seemed like it was going to be the last pugilistic project the company would ever greenlight. And I can't let that slide, and have been itching to talk about this absolute cluster ever since I started this show. Not sure if you guys remember, but the turn of the century was a particularly rough time for fighting games, and all of the punches, 10 strings, and anti-airs didn't really prevent that. While Capcom diversified their lineup with survival horror and action games, SNK wasn't so lucky. Yes, the story actually starts with the masters of the 100 Mega Shock, Shin Nihon Kikaku. They were unfortunately at the center of a number of bombs like the Neo Geo CD and the Hyper Neo Geo 64, and that's not even accounting for the sudden decline of arcades in the West, which obviously hurt them. Even their collaboration with Capcom, which resulted in what some consider to be the pinnacle of 2D fighting, CVS 1 and 2, well, it did almost nothing to boost their bottom line. Since Capcom were the ones who developed those smash hits, SNK saw a mere pittance via character licensing fees, and their version of the same concept, SVC Chaos, was rushed and unfortunately underperformed. Why was it rushed though? Well, because the company was imploding on the inside. SNK USA had to be shut down, SNK's founder left, and all of the Japanese staff splintered off to look for work elsewhere, with some forming brand new companies like Dimps. Now, during all of this, somehow Capcom and SNK were in negotiations to produce a third round of Millionaire Fighting, but for the reasons I just listed, the deal fell apart. There's even more to the messy tale of SNK's death and eventual rebirth, but since it involves, pachinko, I don't really have the energy to go into it right now. The important part for our story is that a number of SNK's staff, including one Toyohisa Tanabe, a systems and chief director on the first 4 King of Fighters titles, joined Capcom around this time, and it's with him where this layered story truly begins.
Round 1. Fight!
When Tanabe and the rest of the SNK refugees entered the Osaka offices of Capsule Computers, they did feel out of place in the company that had essentially been their rival for a number of years. When we joined Capcom, there were 2 plans put forward for the kind of game we would develop. We had a lot of people on our team with experience developing fighting games, so our first idea was to make our own fighting game. However, creating a fighting game from scratch with a new gameplay system would have been very time-consuming, and as a new team at Capcom, we felt we had to contribute something to the company as quickly as possible. So instead, we went with our second idea, which was to use Capcom's pre-existing assets as the foundation for a new project. That's how Capcom Fighting AllStars development began. Yoshiki Okamoto, a big Capcom producer at the time, also presented the former SNKers with another opportunity to work on an action game of unclear origin. It was either DMC2 or Chaos Legion, or they could just push forward with a fighting game project. Those pre-existing assets Tanabe mentioned earlier, those were the scraps of what had been Capcom vs. SNK 3. Apparently, that had started life as a 3D project, with actual models having been made, but since SNK had gone belly up and the rights to their characters and franchises were at that time very much in flux, the work was just sitting there, unused. Tanabe was made the director and decided that the best way to make something quickly was to opt for a Capcom vs. Capcom style slugfest, plucking several characters from not just their fighting games like Ryu, Morrigan, and Batsu, but a few unexpected picks like Hagar, Poison, and Strider Hiryu. To explain this wild mashup that was more or less sticking to canon, unlike prior Versus games, it would take place in a metro city that was under threat of exploding by a bomb known as Laughter Sun, a plot literally orchestrated by death. 3 particular characters, however, all OCs do not steal, had a piece of a code that, when combined, would disarm said laughter son and pretty much save the day. These 3 characters would logically be known as the Code Holders, the game's sometimes used but always derided subtitle. Now, technically, this would be the first traditional 3D fighting game developed by Capcom that was using Street Fighter characters, as the EX series was made by Akira, so there was obviously going to be some growing pains. This is doubly true because the majority of the team was composed of ex-SNK staff, after all, who up to that point had barely touched 3D programming and design. While Capcom had branched out in this way with other new fighting franchises like your Rival Schools or your Power Stones, there was some hesitancy on how to approach a game like this, to do Street Fighter and Darkstalkers justice in a brand new dimension. Since Tanabe had been appointed director, he and his team felt it best to do something unique, so they expanded on the story, something Street Fighter had shied away from at this time. They created 4 brand new characters that were designed to be a bit more stylish, i.e. SNK as shit, and then they wanted it to be more dramatic, and they instituted a few new systems. The first, appropriately called Dramatic Counter, functioned a lot like Tekken 7, where the action would slow down to highlight whenever a character dodged, then counterattacked. Next was Declaration of Victory, a special taunt that one could choose to invoke before a match. If they then went on to win that first round, then the entire match victory point would be awarded to them. Certainly a unique but bullshit feature. That's almost as dumb as...
Critical Parade.
I don't know, sacrificing your tag partner for like a 7-second buff. Oh, I'm so glad that never existed. The final spice added to the game was, finishing moves. Yeah, you heard right. These were flashy attack animations that could only be triggered at the end of a match, and while not graphically violent, were kind of shocking to see in a 2003 Capcom game. It wouldn't be until years later where you saw more stuff like this, such as various level 3 cinematic supers. With all of these changes, Capcom upper management started to get concerned, so they felt it was warranted that the Code Holders should go on location to gather fan feedback. By this point, almost a year and a half, the game had mostly been finished, although it still needed fine-tuning, extra characters, and a translation pass. Unfortunately, the location testing did not go so well, as many players came away unimpressed by AllStars from both a visual and gameplay standpoint. The game didn't look very advanced when compared to the newest Tekken or Virtua Fighter. The original characters stuck out like sore thumbs when placed against Capcom's most iconic, and the gameplay was singled out as feeling a bit awkward and not in line with what most people expected or wanted. These tests went so poorly, even in Japan, that the fate of the entire game was hanging in the balance back at Capcom headquarters. Tanabe's team wanted to take that feedback to improve the game, and even started to staff up to expedite that process, but before that could truly kick off, the axe came down. Fighting AllStars was cancelled, and while the feedback was definitely a root cause for this, it wasn't the only one. With arcade business dramatically slowing down and stuff like Resident Evil selling gangbusters, Capcom's fighting game division was in the process of being phased out. You can get some additional details on this with our Devil May Cry 2 episode. Legendary Capcom designer and artist Akira Akiman Yasuda, in an interview, recalled this time at the company. You know Resident Evil, right? The people who had started that project wanted to challenge themselves. The old way of doing things was no longer working. I think they wanted to find a new style, a new way forward, and it did provide some hints to the company's direction in a number of different ways. I think there were also people in the lower levels levels of the staff saying that Street Fighter is no longer selling, so we want to make something else that's not a fighting game. The Street Fighter Alpha series had been going on for a while and everyone was bored of that, so I think this felt like the moment to try something new, to go after a new challenge. Noritaka Funamizu, Capcom general producer, was also a big fan of Animal Crossing, so I think he wanted to make something similar to Animal Crossing, which in some way or another actually wound up becoming Monster Hunter. While it's always good to diversify and challenge oneself, it's still a shame because Capcom were in talks with SNK to acquire the rights for a special guest character, which, judging from his silhouette, many believe to have been K-Dash, but in subsequent interviews over the years, it was heavily hinted to be Kyo Kusanagi. SNK had apparently signed off on this, but since the game's arcade and eventual PS2 port were shut down so suddenly, it never came to be. Tanabe, as you can imagine, lamented the game's cancellation. I felt that Fighting AllStars ended the way it did due to my inexperience. It caused problems to the company, and I'm sorry to the staff who worked hard on it, and everyone who helped us. Even 10 years later, it's still a bit difficult to talk about. However, I felt I'd been saved a little bit when Ingrid appeared in Fighting Evolution. Ah, yeah, Fighting Evolution. While I'm aware that's supposed to be the main game this episode is about, this slapdash hack job wouldn't have existed without Fighting AllStars. And while Evolution's development was way shorter and less dramatic, it's the far more infamous game. Tanabe and some of the staff moved on to Flagship Limited, an independent studio co-funded by Capcom, Sega, and Nintendo, who would support them on various titles. This left the work on Fighting AllStars just sitting there, unused, which was eerily similar to its precursor CVS3. This was the state of fighting games at Capcom around this time, abandoned and neglected.
And no one knows what it's like to be hated.
Capcom higher-ups, however, were displeased that money had been spent without seeing a return. Well, maybe you should have canceled the goddamn thing! Thus, they scrambled to do something with the concept. Hidetoshi Ishizawa, who had been working on Capcom Fighter since Alpha 2, was assigned to pick up the pieces, but one of the main producers backing him up had dropped out, and thus Yoshinori Ono stepped in to manage the game's production. The order from Capcom bigwigs was thus: finish this shit as fast as possible and as cheaply as possible. Don't spend money or get creative for any reason. Thus, Capcom Fighting Jam / Evolution was born. Since the fighting game division was getting murked left and right, the team was given approximately zero budget, so every character, save for Ingrid, was simply ripped from previous games, despite them having, incredibly contrasting art styles and animation quality. Street Fighter, several versions of it, Darkstalkers and Red Earth were represented, but that still left out several fan-favorite characters, like Ken, Morrigan, or Cammy. Capcom also had zero time to work on the game's endings, so those were farmed out to comic book studio Udon under the strictest of deadlines. These endings were devoid of voiceovers, written dialogue, or even sound effects. Something that was originally going to be implemented was a team repping Street Fighter 1, since it was the only era of street fighting not represented. This faction would have consisted of Eagle, using his Capcom vs. SNK look, Retsu, the only other new sprite in the game, and finally Sagat, a younger pre-scarred version of the Mutai Emperor. Unfortunately, this entire concept was eventually cut. Try to act surprised, as there simply wasn't any time or budget left for it. These restrictions also affected the core gameplay, as each faction of characters played like the games they hailed from, so Third Strike Chun-Li could parry, but Street Fighter II Ryu could not, no matter what. There weren't even any modes or grooves to select from, so you couldn't mix and match each style, which left the entire roster stupidly unbalanced, and not in a fun Jackie Chan Fists of Fire way, but instead in a lame, unfair fun Capcom Fighting Evolution way. Balancing can sometimes be the most arduous and time-consuming thing when working on a fighting game, so it's not shocking there's none here. The ultimate indicator that the game was rushed, however, has to be its backgrounds. In the CVS games, whether they were 2D or 3D, the stages that set the tone for each bout were incredibly imaginative and detailed, but that was worlds away from what was on display here. Simple, static images, some of which might be just actual photos of real places with barely a hint of animation, proudly displayed character art ripped from completely random sources. It's actually kind of unbelievable.
Unbelievable!
The only thing more unbelievable is all the amazing Shinkiro art that was wasted on this whole debacle. It wasn't even used for like the Western box art. When Fighting Evolution launched for the PS2 and Xbox with almost zero promotion, the critical reception was pretty savage, with it scoring in the lowest bracket for a Capcom fighting title since, I don't know, Street Fighter 1? Coincidentally, sales were just as, if not lower. Fans were also disappointed since this was coming off the cancellation of Fighting AllStars and was released alongside games like Tekken 5 and Mortal Kombat Deception, which had far more effort put into them and were pushing the respective franchises forward. This is not a knock on the team at Capcom, mind you. They were only working within their means. Regardless, Fighting Evolution came and went with a barely audible fart. As time went on, technology progressed, and other smaller companies were gaining experience working on anime fighters like Naruto and DBZ, so with a dream in his head and a pep in his step, Ono decided to pit Street Fighter to Capcom once again, and would specifically need to convince Papa Inafune of its viability. Since very few people at Capcom even had fighting game expertise anymore, Ono suggested using companies like Dimps and Aiding to get the job done, which would also minimize risk and not divert staff from other projects. It was a tough proposition though. Tekken and Virtua Fighter were selling at an all-time low, and even the reborn SNK had failed to see success with stuff like Samurai Shodown Sen. Fortunately, the eventual success of Street Fighter 4 would spur Capcom to invest back into the genre, and while it certainly hasn't been problem-free since then, yeah, let's go with that, Street Fighter's return seemed to usher in a new chapter for everybody, which is great, but man, it was quite a road to get there. From SNK's death, to a cancelled CVS sequel, to a cancelled 3D affair, to one of the worst fighters the company ever put out. Now, since the beat-em-up is also back in fashion, why don't we start reviving Final Fight again? Please? Capcom, I'll literally suck your d***. If you know of any other genres, games, or movies that struggled to stay afloat, gasping for every breath, let me know in the comments below, over on my Twitter, or take an elevator up to the Flophouse VIP Tower and become a big Shadaloo boss to nominate the subject we'll be taking on in the future. See you next time, and
Don't forget the Morrigan, like all over the world.